This number appears in the Bible almost casually in 1 Kings 11:3. But when you pause and think about it, the reality becomes disturbing. If Solomon spent just one night with each woman without repeating, it would take almost 3 years to see them all. That means some of those women might wait 3 full years just to see their own husband. 3 years living inside a guarded palace complex. 3 years surrounded by hundreds of other women competing for the same man. 3 years without the freedom to leave. Without the freedom to choose. Without the freedom to refuse. But the darkest part of this story is not the number of women. The darkest part is why they were there. Because those 1,000 women were not there for love. Most of them were there for politics. When people imagine Solomon's palace, they often imagine a king overwhelmed by pleasure. But the truth is much colder. These marriages were political alliances. Every wife represented a treaty. Every marriage represented a deal between kingdoms. In the ancient world, powerful kings demanded the daughters of other rulers as guarantees of loyalty. If a smaller kingdom wanted peace with Israel, they might send a princess to marry Solomon. That princess became more than a wife. She became a living political contract. If her father betrayed the alliance, she could pay the price. This system made Solomon incredibly powerful. One of his most famous marriages was recorded in 1 Kings 3:1 when he married the daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt. This was extraordinary. For centuries, Egyptian rulers refused to give their daughters to foreign kings. Yet Solomon managed to secure that alliance. But when these foreign princesses came to Jerusalem, they didn't come alone. They brought servants, priests, musicians, cooks, and most importantly, they brought their religions. Every princess brought the gods of her homeland. Slowly, quietly, Jerusalem began to change. What looked like a palace filled with wives was actually a complex system of diplomacy, politics, and influence. And the 300 concubines, they often came from conquered territories or smaller tribes. Sometimes they were simply tributes from defeated nations. The Palace of Solomon was not just a residence. It was a political empire built on marriages. But this system created something unexpected, because bringing hundreds of foreign women into the kingdom also brought hundreds of foreign beliefs. And those beliefs would eventually change Solomon himself. But before we understand that transformation, we must look at something even more shocking, the size and cost of the royal palace itself. Because Solomon's palace was not just a building, it was an entire city. The palace city and the invisible war inside the harem, the palace of Solomon, was enormous. According to 1 Kings 4:22-23, the royal court consumed incredible amounts of food every single day. 30 cattle, 100 sheep, and countless other animals. Thousands of liters of flour were used daily. Why? Because the palace wasn't feeding just a king. It was feeding thousands of people. Historians estimate that between 3,000 and 5,000 people lived inside Solomon's palace complex. Servants, guards, officials, priests, and of course, the 1,000 women and their attendants. The palace, described in 1 Kings 7, took 13 years to build. That was almost twice the time it took to build the Temple of God. Inside this massive complex were halls of cedar wood from Lebanon, huge courtyards, gardens, fountains, separate living quarters for royal wives, and even an entire palace built specially for the daughter of the Pharaoh. But the most fascinating part of this palace was the harem hierarchy, because inside those walls, a silent war was happening. Every wife wanted the same thing, not love, not luxury, power. In ancient Israel, the queen was not the king's wife. The queen was the king's mother. Solomon's mother Bathsheba held enormous influence, so every wife in the palace had one goal: to give birth to the next king, because if her son became king, she would become the queen mother, the most powerful woman in the kingdom. Now imagine 700 royal wives from different nations competing for that position. Egyptian princesses, Phoenicia, nobles, Moabite daughters, Ammonite royals, each representing the interests of their homeland. each trying to secure power. And between them moved the palace eunuchs, the officials who controlled access to the king. They carried messages. They controlled invitations. They knew everyone's secrets. Inside the harem, alliances formed, rivalries exploded, secrets were traded, and behind this entire system was another dangerous influence. Because these women did not abandon their religions, they brought their gods with them. And soon those gods began appearing in Jerusalem. Temples were built, altars were raised, and the city that once worshipped one god slowly became a place filled with many. Among these foreign gods were some of the most disturbing in ancient history, and the rituals connected to them would shock anyone who learned about them, because one of those gods demanded something unthinkable: human sacrifice. The fall of Solomon and the price of 1,000 women as Solomon grew older. Something began to change. The Bible describes it clearly in 1 Kings 11:4. His wives turned his heart toward other gods. Among these gods were Ashtoreth, Chemosh, and the terrifying Molech. The worship of Molech was especially horrifying. Historical sources describe a bronze statue heated by fire. Children were placed in its burning arms as sacrifices. The Bible says Solomon built places of worship for these gods near Jerusalem. The same king who built the temple of God had also built altars for foreign gods. This was the beginning of his downfall. The Bible says God became angry with Solomon, and the punishment would not come during his lifetime. It would fall on his kingdom after his death. Enemies began rising against him. Rival leaders appeared, and one of his own officials, Jeroboam, would eventually lead a rebellion. But perhaps the most revealing insight into Solomon's final years comes from another biblical book, Ecclesiastes. In this book, the aging king reflects on his life. He describes his wealth, his palaces, his gardens, his gold, and his countless women. Then he delivers a shocking conclusion. Everything was meaningless. The Hebrew word used is hevel. It means vapor, smoke, something that appears briefly and disappears. Solomon had everything: power, wealth, fame, pleasure. Yet in the end, he declared it all empty. After Solomon died, his son Rehoboam inherited the throne. But the heavy taxes Solomon imposed and made the people angry. When Rehoboam refused to reduce the burden, the kingdom split apart. 10 tribes formed the northern kingdom of Israel. 2 tribes remained in Kingdom of Judah. The great united kingdom created by Solomon collapsed almost immediately after his death, and centuries later, even the temple he built would be destroyed by the Nebuchadnezzar, the second of Babylon. In the end, Solomon left behind a lesson that still echoes today. The wisest man in history discovered something very simple. Wisdom is not about knowledge. Wisdom is about what you do with what you know. Because between knowing the truth and living the truth, there is an abyss, and sometimes entire kingdoms fall into it. To understand the true scale of Solomon's royal household, we must imagine the daily life of the women inside his palace. For most of history, the number 700 wives and 300 concubines has fascinated readers. But behind that number were real human lives. Women with hopes, women with fears, women taken far away from their homelands. Some of them were princesses from powerful kingdoms. Others were daughters of nobles, and many came from smaller nations that had no choice but to obey the growing power of Israel. When a foreign princess arrived in Jerusalem, she was entering a completely different world. She left behind her language, her family, and everything she knew. Her new life would exist inside a carefully controlled palace system. The harem was not a chaotic group of women competing randomly. It was highly organized. There were strict rules, schedules. Servants assigned 2 different groups of wives. Some women held higher rank because they came from more powerful families. Others held influence because they had already given birth to sons. The palace operated almost like a small city. Thousands of people moved through its halls every day. Servants prepared food. Guards patrolled the gates. Officials recorded palace business. Messengers carried orders across the kingdom. And somewhere inside this enormous system lived hundreds of royal wives. Most of them rarely saw the king. Even though Solomon was their husband, Access to him was carefully controlled. Eunuchs and palace officials decided which women could visit the king and when. Some wives may have waited months or even years for their turn. This reality meant that the harem was full of tension, because the future of every woman inside those walls depended on one thing: having a son. A son could change everything. In ancient monarchies, the mother of the king became one of the most powerful figures in the entire kingdom. If a woman in the harem gave birth to the next ruler, her status would rise instantly. She would move from a forgotten wife to the mother of the king. History shows how powerful this position could become. Solomon's own mother, Bathsheba, had played an important role in securing her son's throne. In 1 Kings 1, Bathsheba helped arrange the political situation that allowed Solomon to become king instead of his brother. This meant every woman in the palace knew the same truth. If her son became king, she could control enormous power. Because of this, quiet rivalries developed between the wives. They formed alliances, shared secrets, and sometimes competed for influence. Foreign princesses often stayed close to the servants and advisors who came with them from their homeland. These small groups preserved their languages and traditions inside the palace. In many ways, Solomon's palace became one of the most culturally diverse places in the ancient world. Women from different nations brought music, clothing, styles, foods, and customs. But they also brought their religions. Each princess had grown up worshipping the gods of her homeland, and those beliefs did not disappear when she arrived in Jerusalem. Small shrines began appearing. Private prayer spaces were built. Foreign priests visited the palace. Over time, the religious landscape of the kingdom slowly changed. The city that had once been known for worshipping one god was now surrounded by new temples and altars. The Bible says Solomon allowed many of these places to exist. Some historians believe this decision came from political pressure. If Solomon refused to respect the religions of his wives, their home kingdoms might see it as an insult. Diplomatic alliances could break, trade could suffer, and war could become more likely. So Solomon allowed it, but every compromise brought new consequences, because religion in the ancient world was not just personal belief. It was deeply connected to identity, politics, and culture. And soon those foreign influences began affecting Solomon himself. The king, who had once been famous for wisdom, slowly began making decisions that confused many of his advisors. Temples for foreign gods appeared on the hills near Jerusalem. Altars were built. Sacrifices were performed. Some of these practices shocked the people of Israel. Among the most disturbing was the worship of Molech. Ancient sources describe this god as demanding human sacrifice. Children were sometimes offered as part of religious rituals, while historians still debate the exact details of these ceremonies. The idea alone horrified many people. The Bible strongly condemned such practices, yet the influence of Solomon's foreign alliances had allowed these religions to gain a foothold near Jerusalem. For many faithful followers, this felt like a betrayal. How could the king who built the temple also allow worship of other gods? But Solomon's story shows how slowly power can change a person. At the beginning of his reign, Solomon had prayed for wisdom. According to 1 Kings 3, God offered him anything he wanted. Instead of asking for wealth or power, Solomon asked for understanding. That request made him famous. His wisdom became legendary across the ancient world. Kings and queens traveled long distances to hear his judgments. One of the most famous visitors was Queen of Sheba. She traveled to Jerusalem to see whether the stories about Solomon's wisdom were true. According to the Bible, she left amazed by what she saw. But even wisdom has limits when power and temptation grow stronger over time. Solomon's wealth expanded year after year. His palace grew larger. His alliances multiplied and his household filled with more and more foreign influences. The same system that once strengthened his kingdom slowly began weakening it, because every alliance created obligations. Every political marriage created expectations. Every temple built for a foreign god created tension inside Israel. The king who had once united the nation now found himself balancing dozens of competing interests. Foreign rulers expected loyalty. Local priests expected faithfulness to tradition. Nobles demanded protection of their power. And inside the palace, Hundreds of wives watched closely for any opportunity to improve their position. Running such a complex system required constant attention. Yet as Solomon grew older, his focus seemed to drift. His building projects continued. His wealth continued to increase. But the unity of the kingdom quietly began to weaken. Small rebellions started appearing in distant regions. Former allies became enemies. Leaders who once served Solomon began preparing for a future without him. Among those leaders was a man named Jeroboam. At first, Jeroboam was simply an official working under Solomon. But his ambition would eventually change the history of Israel, because after Solomon's death, Jeroboam would lead a rebellion that split the kingdom in two. The seeds of that future conflict were already growing during Solomon's lifetime, and many historians believe the enormous palace system, including the vast harem, played a role in creating those tensions. Maintaining thousands of people required enormous resources. Taxes increased, labor demands grew. Farmers and workers across the kingdom were forced to support the royal court. Over time, resentment began building among the people. While the palace lived in luxury, ordinary families struggled under heavy burdens. The king who once symbolized wisdom now symbolized excess, and history shows that when rulers become too distant from their people, trouble is never far behind. Yet inside the palace walls, life continued as usual. Servants carried trays of food through the halls. Musicians played during evening gatherings. Priests offered prayers in the temple, and hundreds of royal wives waited quietly for their rare moments with the king. Some of them would spend their entire lives inside those walls. Their stories lost to history, their voices never recorded. But their presence changed the course of Solomon's reign, because each alliance they represented slowly pulled the kingdom in different directions. By the time Solomon reached the final years of his life, the consequences of those choices were becoming impossible to ignore. Enemies surrounded Israel. The loyalty of the people was weakening, and the enormous kingdom that once seemed unbreakable stood on the edge of division. Soon, the death of Solomon would reveal just how fragile his empire had become, and the world would see that even the greatest kingdoms can collapse when power grows faster than wisdom.